Well, with diplomatic tensions fueling talk of a new Cold War, a documentary film being released this weekend tells the story of a fascinating and little-known episode from the old Cold War. It all took place in the 1950s at a time when America was trying to counter Soviet propaganda, and the Eisenhower administration found an unusual way for the United States to blow its own trumpet.
5,000 Greeks stage an anti-American riot in Athens.
In Greece, the government said, send the Gillespie band. We would like the kamikaze band. Like, send it wherever there's problems, send this band.
Well, I mean, the excitement was, was really mind-boggling.
There would be 3 or 4 armed guards making sure that they didn't come over and talk to us.
Extract there from the film called The Jazz Ambassadors. It tells the story of a US State Department program to send jazz greats such as Louis, or Louis as he called himself, Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie and Dave Brubeck beyond the Iron Curtain, into parts of the world being bombarded by messages about America's racial divisions. The idea was to give a positive impression of a harmoniously multiracial country, but some of the ambassadors felt uncomfortable about being the smiling face of America overseas when the ugliest episodes of the civil rights era were being played out at home. The film's director is Hugo Berkeley.
So in the mid-1950s, during the height of the Cold War, there was a military conflict, but there was also a informational propaganda conflict that was going on. And both the Soviet Union and the United States were trying to win the hearts and minds of people, not only in their respective countries, but around the world. And this was also a period of time when decolonisation movements were really gathering pace. There was a great deal of independence movements that were being fomented in Africa and Asia and India, and which way these countries would go was very important. Well, it turned out that there was a great deal of Soviet propaganda about the treatment of African Americans within the United States, and this was a subject that had great capital in Asia, Africa, other countries. And really Russia was, the Soviet Union was saying, why would you want to support the United States when they treat their own non-white people as second-class citizens? One of the ways that a congressman by the name of Adam Clayton Powell Jr. persuaded other lawmakers in the United States to try to create a different narrative about race was to look to America's great jazz musicians, the Duke Ellingtons, Louis Armstrongs, the great impresarios of American jazz, as a means of telling a different story about race. And so in 1956, Dizzy Gillespie was asked to represent the United States as a cultural ambassador, and the Jazz Ambassadors program was born.
Were the ambassadors willing ambassadors?
I think they understood the inherent paradox that they were both being asked to support a country that they very strongly believed should win the Cold War, and yet on the other hand they were supporters of civil rights and a progressive agenda within their own country. So how to balance those two competing aims? And I think each musician found a way of squaring the circle, let's say, of finding a way of pushing back on the official aims and using that platform to create a civil rights agenda in the international context.
Let's perhaps have a listen to one of the songs that Louis Armstrong played, Black and Blue, and that was a very poignant song about race.
Cold empty bed, springs hard as lead.
So there's a famous performance of Louis Armstrong in the Gold Coast, playing before Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was then Prime Minister of the Gold Coast and would soon become the President of the new Republic of Ghana. And he played this song in a concert there. I think it's an important song, as we talk about in the film, because he's singing about a kind of universal sorrow associated with racism, a universal questioning of oneself. Am I not good enough? The lyrics in that song say, my only sin is in my skin. What did I do to be so black and blue?
Wished I was dead. What did I do to be so black and blue?
So there's a real internal discussion of race, and I think that cuts across any country or experience.
And does it undercut the message that the State Department was trying to put across?
Well, I think that's the genius of these musicians, that they were able to create their own platform, forge their own agenda, say the things that they wanted to say. Dizzy Gillespie famously said when the State Department asked him to come in for a briefing, "I've got 300 years of briefing." So he knew very well what he wanted to say, and he took that platform and used it to his own ends. And I think that's what's really empowering about the film. It's maybe a moment when jazz really goes global. This really took jazz musicians like Dizzy Gillespie into Pakistan. It took Duke Ellington to write the Far East Suite. I mean, Dave Brubeck's Jazz Impressions of Eurasia. So there's a real rich heritage, a moment when countries invested in culture, in bridging cultural divides, as a real antidote to militarization and a military standoff. So the fact that Benny Goodman was touring in the Soviet Union within 6 months of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that had to have helped on some level. And I think probably today that's as important a lesson as ever.
That was Hugo Berkeley, the director of The Jazz Ambassadors, which has its international premiere this weekend.